The monks weren't more disciplined than you. They were smarter. For over 1,000 years, Shaolin masters operated a behavioral system so precise it made willpower completely irrelevant. What they built is an ancient history. It's the most advanced performance protocol you've never been taught. Why willpower is the wrong tool for the job. There is a fundamental error embedded in the way high-achieving culture talks about discipline, and it is costing you more than you realize. Not in motivation, not in potential, in architecture. The system you are using to try to perform at your highest level was never designed to work, and the evidence for this has been sitting in the mountains of central China for over 14 centuries. Before we go deeper, one thing. If what you find in this investigation challenges the way you have been operating, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every piece of this research connects to the next. Leave in the middle and you lose the thread entirely. Here's the paradox that defines modern high-performance culture. We live in the most information-rich era in human history. There are more books on discipline, more apps for habit tracking, more productivity systems, more motivational content than any generation before us has ever had access to. And yet, by every measurable psychological metric, chronic underperformance, burnout, and the inability to sustain meaningful progress are at record highs. More tools, worse results. This is not a coincidence. It is a diagnostic signal. The signal points to a single root cause. We have been solving the wrong problem. We have been treating performance as a character issue when it is, at its core, a systems engineering issue. And nowhere is this distinction more precise, more documented, and more ruthlessly applied than in the operational protocols of the Shaolin Monastery during the Tang Dynasty. When Western scholars first began seriously studying the Shaolin training system in the 20th century, they focused almost entirely on the physical dimension, the strength, the flexibility, the combat application. They cataloged the movements, analyzed the biomechanics, and largely missed what was actually being engineered. Because the physical training was never the point. It was the output of a behavioral architecture so sophisticated that it automated elite performance without requiring the monks to generate willpower at all. Not less willpower. None. This distinction matters enormously, because if the Shaolin system produced consistent, decades-long high performance in hundreds of individuals simultaneously without relying on motivation or willpower, then willpower is not the mechanism of elite performance. It is a fallback for when the real mechanism is absent. And right now, for most people operating in the modern world, the real mechanism is completely absent. What fills the gap is exhausting, unsustainable, and quietly destroying your capacity to perform at the level you know you are capable of reaching. The name of the real mechanism is the first thing the Shaolin masters would have told you, and it has nothing to do with discipline in the way you currently understand that word. What the Shaolin masters actually built. There is a term in behavioral science that most people have heard, but almost nobody has operationalized correctly. Choice architecture. The design of an environment in such a way that the desired behavior becomes the path of least resistance, the automatic option. The thing that happens not because someone forced themselves, but because the system made it inevitable. It sounds abstract until you stand inside the Shaolin monastery and realize that every single physical, temporal, and social element of that structure was a piece of deliberate choice architecture built over centuries of empirical refinement. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Think about your own performance failures, the projects abandoned, the routines collapsed, the commitments broken. Now ask yourself this: how many of those failures were actually failures of character, and how many were failures of environment design? Because those are two completely different problems with two completely different solutions. And most people spend their entire lives applying the solution for character failures to what is actually an environment design problem. That is a mismatch that no amount of motivation can correct. The Shaolin system eliminated this mismatch with what I would call a three-layer behavioral lock. The first layer was temporal invariability. The bell rang at the same time every morning. Training began at the same time. Meals arrived at the same time. Not as tradition, as neuroscience, applied intuitively centuries before the field existed. The human brain is a pattern recognition and pattern execution machine. When an action is consistently preceded by the same contextual cues, the cue eventually triggers the action automatically, bypassing the need for conscious decision-making entirely. The monks were not waking up and deciding to train. They were responding to a system that had been calibrated to make training the only neurologically available response. Here is where the modern parallel becomes almost uncomfortable. In 2012, researchers at MIT studying decision fatigue in high-stakes environments discovered that the quality of human judgment degrades measurably with each successive decision made in a day. Every choice drains the same cognitive resource. The implication is direct and devastating. Every morning that you wake up without a fixed protocol and have to decide when to start work, what to work on first, whether to check your phone before or after breakfast, you are burning the same finite cognitive fuel that you need for actual high-performance work. By the time many people sit down to do their most important work, they have already spent a significant portion of their daily cognitive capital on decisions that a system could have made for them. The monks never made those decisions. The system made them, which means the monks arrived at every training session with their full cognitive and physiological resources intact, directed entirely toward the work. This is not a small advantage. In cumulative terms, across months and years, this is the operational difference between mastery and permanent mediocrity. The second layer of the behavioral lock was positional. And this is where a behavioral engineer in Silicon Valley and a Shaolin master from the 7th century would find themselves in complete agreement. How the elite operationalized the Shaolin Protocol. The second layer of the Shaolin behavioral lock was what the masters called fixed position within the training hall. Every monk had a specific location in the space. Every location carried a specific expectation. The moment a monk stepped into his designated position, before a single movement had been executed, the behavioral contract was already active. The environment was doing the work that intention and motivation are falsely credited for doing in modern performance culture. If this sounds like a minor logistical detail, consider what Wendy Wood's landmark research at Duke University revealed in 2006. Approximately 43% of daily human behavior is not the result of conscious decision-making. It is the automatic execution of habits triggered by contextual cues. Spatial cues are among the most powerful triggers the brain responds to. The office desk that is only ever used for deep work. The gym bag placed by the door the night before. The specific chair reserved exclusively for strategic thinking. These are not motivational tools. They are environmental signals that activate pre-wired behavioral patterns without requiring the deliberate engagement of the prefrontal cortex. The Shaolin masters had been engineering this effect for centuries before neuroscience gave it a name. Now connect this to the world you actually operate in. How many of your workspaces are contaminated with competing behavioral signals? The desk where you work is the same surface where you scroll, eat, argue over email, and watch content. The brain receives contradictory cues from the same environment and performs the neurological equivalent of buffering. Nothing executes cleanly. Everything requires more effort than it should. You call this lack of discipline. The more precise diagnosis is environmental contamination. The third layer of the Shaolin behavioral lock is the one that receives the least attention in modern performance literature and is arguably the most powerful. It is what I am calling social calibration. The monks did not train in isolation. They trained in synchronized groups where every individual's level was visible to every other individual, not as a mechanism of shame or competition in the conventional sense, but as a system of behavioral anchoring. When your standard of performance is physically visible to peers operating at a similar or higher level, regression carries a social cost that the brain is neurologically wired to avoid. The behavioral bar of the group becomes a structural floor below which individual performance does not fall, not because of external pressure, but because the architecture of the social environment makes regression more cognitively uncomfortable than sustained effort. This is what the most sophisticated performance teams in the world have rediscovered in the last decade. The Navy SEAL training philosophy built around the concept that individual selection is largely a function of team environment. The research from Google's Project Aristotle showing that psychological safety within high-caliber groups outperforms individual talent as a predictor of team output. The Shaolin Monastery had operationalized a version of this centuries earlier with no academic framework and no institutional research budget, just ruthless empirical observation of what actually produced consistent performance over time. And now the question that determines whether this stays as an intellectual exercise or becomes a structural shift in how you operate. Like this video now, not as a favor, as a signal to the algorithm that this type of analysis should reach others who think at this level. That is how investigations like this one survive long enough to matter. The emotional pivot. I want to stop the analysis for a moment and ask you something direct, not rhetorical, not as a genuine question that I want you to sit with before we move into the final act. How much of your identity is currently built around the story that you lack discipline? How deeply have you internalized the narrative that other people have something you do not? Some reserve of mental toughness, some biological advantage in focus or consistency that explains why they perform at levels you have not yet reached. Because if that story is operational inside you right now, what you are about to hear is going to dismantle it. And dismantling a story that has been running for years is not a purely intellectual event. It is uncomfortable in a way that is worth acknowledging before we proceed. The Shaolin system reveals something about human performance that is both liberating and deeply confrontational. It is liberating because it means that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is not a character gap. It is a design gap. You are not broken. Your system is. And systems can be rebuilt. The confrontational part is the corollary. If it is a design gap, then the responsibility for closing it is entirely yours. Not your environment's fault. Not your upbringings. Not your neurologies. Yours. Because you now know what the design looks like. The monks who entered the Shaolin Monastery were not selected for exceptional willpower. The historical records that survive from that period indicate that selection was based primarily on physical potential and capacity for instruction, not on demonstrated discipline. The discipline was not a prerequisite for entry. It was an output of the system the monastery provided. The monastery took ordinary individuals with ordinary levels of self-control, and, through the architecture of the environment, produced extraordinary and consistent performers. The architecture did what the individuals could not have done alone. You have been alone in the wrong architecture for too long, operating in an environment that was not designed to support your highest performance, blaming yourself for the predictable results, and then trying harder within the same broken system. Trying harder within a broken system does not fix the system. It accelerates the depletion of the resource you can least afford to waste, which is the cognitive and emotional capital that actual high performance requires. There is a version of your current life where the behaviors you have been forcing through sheer effort become the default, the automatic, the inevitable. Not because you became a different person, because you built a different system around the person you already are. The Shaolin monks did not transform their characters inside the monastery. They transformed their architecture, and the performance followed as a matter of engineering, not of willpower. The final act of this investigation is where the ancient protocol meets your actual present, and the translation is more precise and more immediately applicable than you might expect. What if you stopped fighting yourself and started engineering your environment? The most important reframe in this entire investigation is this. High performance is not the result of sustained effort against resistance. It is the result of intelligent design that removes resistance from the equation before the effort begins. The Shaolin masters did not wake up every morning and overcome the desire to stay in bed. They built a system where the desire to stay in bed was architecturally irrelevant. The bell rang. The position waited. The group was already moving. The environment had already made the decision. This is the Shaolin Protocol, translated for the century you actually live in. And it begins not with adding more to your routine, but with the friction audit of what is already there. The first operational step is the one the monastery enforced without negotiation. Identify the single most important behavioral output you need to produce consistently. The work, the training, the practice, the study, whatever it is that, if executed with regularity, compounds into the result you are after. Then map every decision point that currently stands between you and the execution of that behavior. Every moment where the environment asks your conscious brain to make a choice is a moment where the battery drains before the work begins. The goal is to eliminate as many of those decision points as possible before tomorrow morning, not through motivation, but through pre-decision. You decide once, in advance, and the system executes automatically. The second step is what I call the activation ritual. The Shaolin bell was not a wake-up call. It was a behavioral trigger, a consistent environmental cue that signaled the nervous system to shift into performance state without requiring conscious initiation. You need a modern equivalent, a sequence of 2 to 4 actions that are fixed, brief, and exclusively associated with the transition into your highest performance behavior. The content of the ritual matters far less than its consistency. The brain learns through pattern repetition, not through meaning. Run the same sequence every time, before the same activity, and within weeks, the sequence itself becomes the trigger. Performance stops being something you start. It becomes something that gets activated. The third step is the one most people resist because it looks like an action, but is in fact the most sophisticated piece of the protocol. Deliberate recovery intervals, scheduled periods of zero stimulation between performance blocks. Not rest in the passive sense, but active neural consolidation, the space where what you just did gets converted from temporary effort into permanent capacity. Without this layer, you are training without letting the training stick. The Shaolin monks built this into the architecture of every single day. Most high performers in the modern world have removed it entirely and then wonder why their growth has plateaued. The self-mastery you have been chasing is not on the other side of more discipline. It is on the other side of better design. Subscribe to this channel and activate the bell. The next investigation goes deeper into the systems that the highest performing individuals in history used to build advantage that compounded across decades, not just days. And before you go, one question that I want you to answer in the comments with specificity, not a general response. What is the single environmental decision point in your current daily routine that consumes the most cognitive energy before you even begin your most important work? Name it exactly, because the answer you write down right now is the beginning of your actual protocol. The Shaolin Protocol is not a historical curiosity. It is a live operating system. And what was decoded here today is only the first door in a much longer corridor.